Morris Watson, a 29-year-old security officer at Silverwind Airport, prepared to begin what felt like just another humdrum shift. Little did he know that his encounter with a mysterious elderly gentleman was going to alter everything. Impeccably attired and clutching a bunch of wilting roses, the old man had been waiting at the airport for days. His relentless presence had become a source of curiosity and a subject of speculation among the airport staff and passengers. When finally Maurice approached him, what he discovered was truly shocking. Blood run cold. In an instant, he was calling for backup, knowing full well every second would count before we dive in. Comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The early morning sun had barely peeked through the expansive windows of Silverwind Airport as Maurice Watson, 29, began his usual morning shift as a security officer. The airport was just starting to stir, with the first wave of travelers trickling in, their rolling suitcases creating a soft rumble against the wax floor. Maurice straightened his crisp black-blue uniform, smoothing a wrinkle as he looked over the gradually filling terminal. Had been working here for 5 years now, and the once exciting bustle of the airport had faded into a predictable hum of activity. The faces changed daily, but the rhythm remained the same, a constant ebb and flow of arrivals and departures. Hells and goodbyes. As he wove through the arrivals hall, Morris took note of the usual mix. Businessmen in sharp suits eyed their watches, smartphones, families with excited children craning their necks to spot familiar faces, weary travelers shuffling along with drooping shoulders and bleary eyes. It was a tapestry of human experiences all woven together in this transient space. Maurice's gaze swept across the rows of benches, a practiced routine of observation. That's when he first noticed him. An elderly man, probably in his 80s, sat on one of the benches alone. There was something in the man that made Morris pause for just a while. The man was well and impressively dressed in beige. The jacket spoke of care and dignity. His stooping now with age, his carriage retained a certain pride. It was, however, the bouquet of bright, blood-red roses resting upon his lap that truly aroused Maurice's attention. Next to him, a small traveling cushion, evidence of practicality amidst the formal setting of himself. As Maurice watched, the old man surveyed the crowd, his eyes reflecting a number of hopes and anxieties, expectant in their regard, as if he awaited some special person. There was little doubt for Maurice that had seen this man before, perhaps yesterday, but he couldn't be certain in the constant flow of people through the airport. Faces often blurred together. Just as Maurice was about to continue his rounds, the elderly man caught his eye and gestured for his attention. There was a gentleness in the motion that made Maurice approach without hesitation. "Excuse me, young man," the elderly gentleman said, his voice soft but clear. "I don't mean to bother you, but could you tell me when Flight 335 will be arriving?" Maurice was taken aback by the man's polite manner. Was a nice contrast to the often shoving travelers he saw every day. "I'm so sorry, sir," Maurice replied with a smile. "As security, I don't have access to the flight schedules, but if you look over there," he nodded to a large digital board on the far wall, "you'll find all the arrival times listed." The elderly man's face lit up with gratitude. "Oh, thank you so much. I'm so sorry to have disturbed you. It's just that I'm expecting someone very important, and I wouldn't want to miss her arrival for the world." The man's words, so expectant yet tinged with a trifle of nervousness, struck home in his heart, and Maurice felt himself give way to a genuine smile at the apparent excitement and politeness of the man. "No problem at all, sir. I hope you find you're a special somebody soon. Good luck." As Maurice moved away, continuing his rounds, he found the smile lingering on his face. The encounter had been short, but there was something about the elderly man's manner, a relic of a generation of people who valued courtesy and patience, that left a warm. The impression Maurice filed away was a pleasant part of his routine, never knowing that this innocuous interchange would very shortly become the catalyst for a deep-seated alteration in his life. The day continued in its usual pattern, just about like any other for Morris. The usual sprinkling of petty flare-ups and irritants accompanying the job-mislaid luggage, confused travelers, and the odd security hitch. As it was time to knock off, Maurice wanted to go home to rest and relax. As he walked out of the security room, his mind was already on the quiet evening ahead. Maurice found himself passing through the arrivals hall. Once more, the space had changed since morning, now full of the warm, golden light of the setting sun streaming through the windows. The crowd had thinned considerably, with only a few stragglers remaining. That's when Morse saw him again. The elderly man from that morning, still sitting in the same spot, a bouquet of roses still cradled so carefully in his lap. The sight stopped Morris dead in his tracks. The old man's eyes were still scanning the thinning crowd, but there was a weariness to his posture that hadn't been there in the morning. The hope in his eyes seemed dimmer, tinged with a growing anxiety that Morris could sense even from a distance. Before he could stop himself, Morris called out, "Sir, did you manage to find the person you were waiting for?" The elderly man turned at the sound of Moore's voice. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something. Disappointment, embarrassment across his face before he replied softly, "I'm still waiting. She should be here soon." He paused, then added with a forced smile, "Have a nice evening, Maurice." Now at the exit, Maurice raised his hand in a farewell wave. "You too, sir. Take care." As Maurice stepped out into the warm evening air, he couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling the encounter had left him with. He headed towards his car, the picture of the waiting man replaying in his mind. En route home, Morris continually found his thoughts returning to the elderly man. It was odd, wasn't it, for anyone to wait so long? Perhaps the flight had been delayed, he reasoned, but then wouldn't the man have known that from the arrival board Maurice had pointed out to him? The more Maurice thought about it, the more details stood out as peculiar. The travel pillow the man had with him, was that a sign he had been prepared for a long wait? Or could it mean something else entirely? Maurice briefly entertained the idea that the man might be homeless seeking shelter in the airport, but that theory didn't fit with the man's elegant attire and the carefully maintained bouquet of roses. Maurice shook his head, trying to shoo the thought away. Probably nothing, he assured himself. Just an unlucky delay or mix-up. Any of those things happen in airports all the time. Yet, driving in evening traffic, Maurice just could not shake that picture of the old man, sitting alone and waiting. The apartment was silent, except for the refrigerator humming and the occasional passing car on the street below. He sat at his small dining table, pushing what was left of his reheated lasagna around his plate as the TV drone was on in the background. But Morris wasn't really watching it. His mind kept drifting back to the airport, to the elderly man with his bouquet of roses. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through social media, without really seeing it. Usually, this nightly routine helped him unwind, but tonight, it felt hollow. The posts and photos of his friends and acquaintances seemed trivial compared with the mystery that had planted itself in his mind. Maurice put down his phone and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He tried to rationalize the situation again. Airports were places of waiting. After all, delays happened all the time. The old man's loved one could have been stuck in transit, or there could have been a miscommunication about arrival times, but something about that explanation didn't sit right with Maurice. The man had been there in the morning, and he was still there when Maurice left in the evening. That was an awfully long delay, wasn't it? Maurice got up and started pacing his small living room. He replayed the interactions in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed about the man's courteous approach with regard to how he handled the roses, the interplay of hope and fear in the man's eyes. It all framed a figure, so eagerly hoping for a reunion. And yet no one had shown up. As he paced, Maurice's eyes came upon a framed picture on his bookshelf. It was one of him with his grandmom, whom he had lost. It had been taken just a few months before she died. The view of it brought him to a stop. His grandmother, he recalled, in her last years had lived alone, as each of his siblings had followed their own roads while his friends gradually passing on. Maurice remembered the loneliness he'd seen in her eyes, sometimes even when she smiled and insisted she was fine. The memory sent a pang through his heart. Was that what he'd seen in the old man's eyes not just anticipation, but a deeper, more profound loneliness? Maurice shook his head, trying to dispel the thought he was projecting. Wasn't he seeing connections where there might not be any? And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than a simple delayed meeting. As he got ready for bed, Maurice found himself thinking again and again about the airport. Mechanically brushed his teeth, his mind repeating every gesture of his meetings with the old man. The polite inquiry into his flight, the manner with which he had grasped the bouquet of roses, the look of tired hope on his face as the day closed in. Maurice lay in bed, slept, expecting sleep to take his mind off the maelstrom of thoughts that swirled through his head. But in the darkness, lying on his back staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come, and what kept haunting him was the vision of that old man, all alone, on that bench. Before his eyes floated, what if the man never came? What if the old man still stood there, waiting through the night? The thought made Morris' stomach clench with worry. He rolled over, punching his pillow in frustration. This was ridiculous. He didn't even know the man, and it bothered him this much, but deep down, Maurice knew why. It was the vulnerability Head sensed, the quiet dignity in the face of what might be crushing disappointment. It reminded him of his grandmother in her final years, of the loneliness that could engulf the elderly when the world moved too fast around them as the night wore on. Morris drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams a confused jumble of airport terminals and lonely benches, of wilting roses and missed connections. Through it all, the figure of the old man waited, a silent sentinel in a sea of transient faces. When Maurice's alarm went off the next morning, he awoke feeling unrest. The unease of the night still clung to him like a shroud. As he got ready for his shift, he made a silent promise to himself. Today he would unravel the mystery behind this. He owed it to himself and to that kind old man who had stirred something deep within him to find out what was really going on. The early morning air was crisp as Morris made his way into Silverwind Airport. He had arrived much earlier than usual, driven by a mixture of curiosity and concern that had followed him from his restless night. The airport was quiet at this hour, with just a few early travelers and the night shift staff getting ready to knock off. As Maurice walked through the arrivals hall, a sense of déjà vu washed over him. His steps slowed as he approached the area where He'd seen the elderly man yesterday. From a distance, he could make out a figure on the same bench, and his heart began to race. Drawing closer, Maurice's suspicions were confirmed. It was indeed the same elderly man, but the sight of him now made Maurice's chest tighten with concern. The man was asleep, his head resting on the small travel pillow Maurice had noticed yesterday. The bouquet of roses, now noticeably wilted, still lay in his lap. Protected even in sleep by loosely curled fingers, Maurice stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The man's elegant beige jacket was slightly rumpled now, his polished shoes scuffed from a day of waiting and sleep. His face looked older, more vulnerable, the lines of worry and hope that had animated it yesterday now slack with exhaustion. A wave of emotions swept over Maurice: concern, sadness, and the growing sense of unease. This man had clearly spent the night in the airport, and though not quite unusual for delays or other minor inconveniences to make people wait for very long periods of time, overcapacity overnight flights, something was amiss here. For sure, Maurice was tempted to wake the man to ask him what was happening and whether he required assistance. But he demurred, looking at the peaceful countenance of the sleeping elderly man after probably a very long and disappointing day of waiting followed by an uncomfortable night on an airport bench. Maurice couldn't bring himself to disturb what little rest the man was getting. Instead, Maurice continued to his security room, his mind churning with questions and concerns. As he changed into his uniform, he couldn't shake the image of the sleeping man from his mind: the wilted roses, the rumpled clothes, the weary slump of his shoulders. Even in sleep, it all painted a picture of prolonged disappointment that tugged at Maurice's heart. Clocking in for his shift, Maurice made a silent promise to himself. He would keep an eye on the elderly man throughout the day. If the situation hadn't changed by the afternoon, he would have to intervene regardless of how awkward or intrusive it might feel. Something was clearly not right, and Maurice felt a growing sense of responsibility to get to the bottom of it. Maurice began his rounds, his thoughts constantly returning to the sleeping figure on the bench. Who was this man waiting for so patiently? Why hadn't they come? And most importantly, what could Morris do to help the day stretched ahead, filled with the usual tasks and responsibilities? But for Maurice, it was now underscored by a quiet tension. He found himself glancing at the clock more often than usual, counting down the hours between his duties, until he was able to investigate further about the older man. In quiet moments, Maurice found himself considering several possibilities. Perhaps he was awaiting a long-lost love to be reunited again once more after many, many years apart. Or maybe it was an estranged family member and wires had gotten crossed about the meeting time. Of each of these possibilities Maurice considered, it seemed to lead to more questions than answers. As lunchtime approached, Maurice made up his mind. He would investigate further about the man again, and this time engage him in conversation. He needed to understand what was going on. More importantly, he needed to ensure that everything was all right with the elderly gentleman. With his determination coupled with apprehension, Maurice started going back to the arrivals hall. Whatever was happening with this mysterious waiting man, now Maurice was committed to seeing it through. Little did he know that this decision set in motion a chain of events which would challenge his perceptions, test his compassion, and ultimately alter his life forever. As Maurice drew near the bench on which the elderly man had gone to sleep, earlier he had discovered him, now awake and alert. The man's eyes, though tired, still held that mixture of hope and anxiety that Maurice had noticed before. The bouquet of roses, now visibly wilted, remained clutched in his lap. Like a lifeline, Maurice took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. He knew he had to be careful, respectful of the man's privacy, while also addressing his growing concerns. "Excuse me, sir." Maurice began, his voice gentle but firm. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right? I couldn't help but notice you've been here since yesterday." The elderly man looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he saw Maurice in his security uniform. For a moment, he seemed startled, as if suddenly realizing how long he had been there. "Oh, yes, he replied, his voice a bit hoarse from disuse. "Everything's fine, young man. I'm just waiting for someone. They'll be here soon, I'm sure of it." Maurice nodded, but he couldn't shake his concern. He decided to press a little further. "Sir, I don't mean to pry, but you've been here for quite a while. Whether you had anything to eat, whether there's someone I can call for you." The elderly man's face softened at Maurice's evident concern. "You're very kind to ask, but really I'm fine. My friend will be here any moment now. I don't want to miss her arrival." Maurice hesitated, then decided to take a more direct approach. "Sir, I apologize if this seems forward, but I need to ask whether you have a place to go. The airport isn't really a place for extended stays, you see." At this, the elderly man's composure faltered slightly. A look of distress briefly crossed his face before he regained his calm composure. "Oh no, young man, you misunderstand. I'm not homeless, if that's what you're thinking. I have a lovely home. It's just, well, it's very important that I'm here when she arrives." Maurice nodded, relieved to hear that the man wasn't homeless, but still troubled by the situation. "I understand, sir, but perhaps we could find a more comfortable place for you to wait, or maybe we could check on the status of the flight you're waiting for." The elderly man shook his head, a gentle but firm refusal. No, that won't be shall need. I am perfectly comfortable here, and she will be here soon. Very soon." There was something in the man's voice, a sort of hope and despair, that pulled at Maurice's heart. He did not want to push him further at this point, lest the man close up entirely. "All right, sir," Maurice yielded. "But please, if you require anything, something to drink, something to eat, or any help whatsoever, don't hesitate to call for me. My name is Maurice, and I will be here all day." The old man smiled, a real warmth in his eyes despite his obvious fatuous. "Thank you, Maurice. You're a good young man. Your parents must be proud." As Maurice walked away, his mind was racing. The conversation had done little to allay his concerns. If anything, it had deepened them. The man clearly wasn't going to leave voluntarily. And while he wasn't breaking any rules per se, his prolonged stay was unusual and potentially concerning. Maurice decided he would keep a close eye on the situation throughout his shift. He would make sure the man had water, and perhaps even bring him some food from the airport cafe. And if by the end of the day there was still no sign of the person he was waiting for, Maurice knew he would have to take more decisive action. Maurice found himself circling back to the elderly man's bench more frequently than his duties strictly required. Each time he passed, the man was there, alert and watchful, the wilting roses still cradled in his lap. The hope in his eyes seemed to dim a little more with each passing hour, replaced by a growing anxiety that Maurice found increasingly difficult to ignore. Finally, as his shift was nearing its end, Maurice made a decision. He couldn't leave without understanding more about this man's situation. With a mixture of determination and apprehension, he approached the bench. "Once more, Sir," Maurice began gently, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm concerned about you. You've been here for quite a while now. Is there anything I can do to help? Perhaps we could try to contact the person you're waiting for." The elderly man looked up at Maurice, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might send the concern packing once more. But then something in his look shifted. The mask of courteous waiting cracked, revealing a fragility that gouged at Maurice's heart. "You are very kind, young man," the old gentleman said, his voice shaking slightly. "I suppose Well, I suppose it would do no harm to discuss it. My name is Harold, by the way. Harold Thompson. Maurice sat down beside Harold, keeping his distance and respect, but close enough to catch the softness in the man's voice. It's nice to meet you properly, Mr. Thompson. I'm Maurice Watson. Can you tell me about the person you're waiting for? Harold's eyes lit up. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Her name is Alejandra. She's the most wonderful woman I've ever known. As Harold spoke, he pulled out his phone. His nailed fingers moved with surprising dexterity across the screen. He pulled up a profile picture of an elderly woman, her silver hair framing a face spread with laugh lines, her eyes twinkling with warmth. We've been dating online for 2 years now, Harold continued, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and yearning. Can you even believe it, at my age to fall in love again is a miracle. Maurice listened, a growing sense of unease building in his stomach. Online dating wasn't a new thing these days, but something about this situation felt off. Harold scrolled through his phone, showing Moore's text messages spilling with warmth and affection. He explained, we've never met in person before. She lives in Africa, you see, but now she's finally coming here. She has cancer, and she's coming for treatment. I'm going to help her to take care of her. Maurice's heart sank as the pieces started to fall into place. He tried to keep his voice neutral as he asked, Mr. Thompson, this must be expensive, the travel, the medical treatments. Harold nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Oh, it is, but she's worth every penny. I brought $33,000 in cash with me. It's everything I have, but what good is money if you can't use it to help the ones you love? The alarm bells that had been ringing quietly in the back of Maurice's mind now blared at full volume. Cash, online dating, someone from another country needing money for medical treatments. It all pointed to one terrible conclusion. Mr. Thompson, Maurice said carefully, when was Alejandra supposed to arrive? Harold's face fell. Well, she was meant to come 2 days ago, but there was a problem with her flight in Africa. She needed more money to rebook her ticket, so I sent it to her. She should be here any moment now. Maurice felt a wave of sadness and anger wash over him. This kind, hopeful man had been taken in by a cruel scam, but how could he tell him? How could he? Dashing the hope that had sustained Harold for the last 3 days. Before Maurice could work out what to do next, Harold's phone whirred. The old man's face lit up, and he peered into the screen. It's her, he exclaimed. She says she's just landed and will be at the exit in 10 minutes. She's reminding me to bring the money. Harold beamed at Maurice. Joy radiated from every line of his face. You see, I told you she'd come. Love always finds a way. Maurice felt as if had been punched in the gut. He knew what was about to happen, the cruel finale of this elaborate scam. In that very moment, he made a split decision that would change everything. Mr. Thompson, he said, his voice firm, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Confused by Moore's sudden shift in tone, Harold nodded hesitantly. I'm going to take your phone for a moment, and I'm going to call for some help. I promise I'll explain everything, but right now I need you to stay here and not go anywhere. Can you do that for me? Harold's confusion deepened, but something in Maurice's earnest expression made him nod in agreement. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Mace took the phone and stepped away. He dialed for backup, describing the situation in hushed, urgent tones to his fellow officers. As he spoke, he could see Harold on the bench, clutching his roses, his eyes fixed on the exit, waiting for a woman who would never come. Mace knew the next few minutes would shatter Harold's world, but he also knew he couldn't stand by and let this kind old man be robbed of his life savings. With backup on the way, Mace steeled himself for what was to come. The story unfolding over the last 3 days was about to reach its climax, and Maurice was resolute that despite the heartbreak that was about to be visiting them, it would not end in tragedy. As he could feel his heart returning to the bench, knowing that backup was on its way, he had one glance at Harold, who was still sitting on the bench, clutching his phone and the now wilted bouquet of roses. The eyes of the elderly man were glued to the exit. Excitement and anxiety were both mingled on his face, and Maurice felt a pang of guilt knowing what was about to unfold within minutes. The rest of Maurice's fellow officers arrived, but they were dressed in plain clothes and blended right into the crowd of travelers. Maurice watched as they assumed strategic positions near the exit, their movements relaxed, yet purposeful. He caught the eye of Officer Sarah Chun, who nodded subtly in return, a signal that the team was ready. Meanwhile, Maurice turned back to Harold. To the latter, It would seem he hadn't noticed the sudden surge in undercover security personnel in his proximity. The elderly man was growing restless. Nervously, his eyes darting between his phone and the exit, Mr. Thompson Maurice said gently, "Are you all right?" Harold looked up, a trembling smile on his face. "Oh, yes, just a bit nervous. I suppose it's our first time meeting in person. You see, I hope I look like my photos." Maurice felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted nothing more than to tell Harold the truth to protect him from the heartbreak that was coming, but he knew that right now the most important thing was to keep Harold safe and catch the criminals who had hoodwinked him. "I'm sure it will be okay," Maurice said, forcing the smile. "Now remember what I said, stay right here, okay? No matter what happens, don't move from this spot. Can you promise me that?" Harold nodded, though he looked a bit confused by Maurice's insistence. "Of course, young man, but why? It's just airport procedure." Maurice lied smoothly, "For security reasons. Trust me, okay?" As Harold agreed, Maurice's radio crackled softly. His team was ready and in position. The tension in the air was palpable as they waited for the scammers to make their move. Harold, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, continued to watch the exit with eager anticipation. Maurice instinctively felt his hand move to his concealed weapon. He was hoping that wouldn't be the case, but whatever happened, he was prepared for any eventualities. The safety of Harold and the civilians in the airport was top of his priorities. With each passing minute, the anticipation inside Maurice grew. His team was ready. The trap was set, and the scammers just needed to walk right into it. The busy airport continued its normal rhythm around them, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Maurice found himself studying Harold's face, noting the lines of hope and excitement etched there. It pained him to know that those same lines would soon be transformed, formed into ones of disappointment and heartbreak. But he steeled himself, reminding himself that what they were doing was necessary, not just to protect Harold, but quite possibly many other vulnerable people who could fall victim to these fraudsters. The waiting seemed interminable. Maurice checked his watch, then scanned the crowd once more. His team remained vigilant. Their eyes moved incessantly, scanning for any sign of the suspects. The airport ambient noise, the chatter of travelers, the rolling of suitcases, the periodic announcements over the PA system all faded into the background as Maurice's senses sharpened, focused entirely on the task at hand. And then, finally, there was movement at the entrance from the parking lot. Maurice's pulse quickened as he spotted two men entering the airport, their eyes scanning the crowd with purpose. The newcomers' black jackets and caps make their way through the crowd with deliberateness. Their eyes scan the crowd until they land on Harold. Maurice felt his pulse quicken. This was it. As they drew closer, Maurice could see them eyeing Harold, taking in Rose's and the eager expression on his face. They exchanged a glance, silent confirmation passing between them, and Maurice's breath caught in his throat. He tensed, ready to spring into action. The next few moments would be crucial. He watched as Harold looked around at the men in confusion, unmistakably not expecting them instead of Alejandra. "Now!" Maurice barked into his radio, springing forward in an instant. The scene exploded in controlled chaos. Maurice's team converged on the two suspects with practiced efficiency. Officer Chun tackled the shorter man just as his hand emerged from his pocket, sending something skittering across the floor. A phone, not a weapon, Maurice noted with relief. The taller suspect tried to bolt, but he was quickly cornered by two other officers. Maurice himself was standing protectively in front of Harold, who had frozen in shock, the roses tumbling from his grasp. "Airport security, don't move," Maurice shouted, his voice carrying authority that cut through the sudden commotion. Travelers nearby gasped and moved back, creating a circle of space around the unfolding scene. Some pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Others hurried away, not wanting to get involved. The two suspects, realizing they were outnumbered and cornered, raised their hands in surrender. Maurice could see the panic in their eyes, the realization that their scheme had spectacularly backfired. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Officer Chin commanded, her voice firm and authoritative. As the suspects did her bidding, Maurice's team moved in to handcuff them. The sound of metal clicking into place seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space. As his colleagues patted them down, retrieving phones, wallets, and a small notebook that Moore suspected contained details of their scam operations, He stood by and watched throughout the commotion. Morris had kept one hand on Harold's shoulder, both to protect him and to prevent him from interfering. Now, with the immediate threat contained, he turned his full attention to the elderly man. Harold's face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. His eyes darted between the arrested men and Maurice, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Maurice, he said, his voice trembling, What's going on? Where's Alejandra?" Maurice felt his heart constrict at the lost look in Harold's eyes. He gently guided the older man back with him to the bench, helping him sit down. "Mr. Thompson, Harold," he started, his voice soft but firm, "I am so sorry, but there is no Alejandra. These men," he gestured to the handcuffed suspects, "were trying to scam you. But you are safe now. We have got them." Harold's knees seemed to give out, and he dropped onto the bench. The reality of the situation seemed to crash down on him all at once. His shoulders slumped, and tears welled in his eyes. No, it can't be," he whispered, hardly audible above the renewed bustle of the airport. The roses lay scattered around the floor, their wilted petals a poignant reminder of Harold's broken dreams. Maurice knelt to gather them up as he cradled the battered bouquet, promising himself and Harold silently that he would see this through no matter what it took. The chaos of the arrest was fading into nothingness as suspects disappeared behind the mechanisms of a police car wall of glass. Maurice and Harold sat side by side on the bench in the midst of the annoying noise and business of the airport. Harold's hands shook as he reached out to one of the fallen roses that Maurice had gathered. Its petals were bruised and wilting, a cruel metaphor for his own battered heart. "No, Alejandra," he muttered, his voice little more than a whisper. "It was all a lie." Maurice felt a lump well up in his throat as he watched the elderly man struggle to come to terms with the truth. "I'm so sorry, Harold," he said softly, easing himself down beside him onto the bench. "These scammers are pros. They prey on kind-hearted people like you. It's not your fault." But Harold wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on his phone, which had pulled from his pocket. With shaking hands, he began to scroll through the messages and photos had exchanged with Alejandra over the past 2 years. Each word, each image that had once brought him joy, now twisted like a knife in his heart. "We talked every day," Harold said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She knew everything about me, my hopes, my fears, my dreams for the future. She said she loved me." He looked up at Maurice, his eyes brimming with tears and confusion. How could it all be fake? How could someone do this? Maurice struggled to find the right words. How could he explain the depths of human cruelty to someone whose heart was so full of love? "Harold, these scammers are skilled manipulators," he began carefully. "They take the time to build trust, to make their victims feel special and loved. But it's all a trick to get money. They don't care about the pain they cause." Harold's face crumpled as the full weight of the deception hit him. "The money," he whispered, looking down at the bag at his feet that contained his life savings. "I was going to give her everything. I thought I had found love again after my wife passed. I never thought I'd feel this way again." And now that the pain in Harold's voice was almost unbearable, Maurice found himself at a loss for words, faced with a grief so raw and immediate. He wanted to offer comfort, but what could he possibly say to ease this kind of betrayal? Harold clung to his phone, staring at Alejandra's profile picture, still desperate to believe. "Maybe she's real," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Maybe she just got mixed up with these bad men. She could still be out there waiting, and we were going to travel, see the world together." Morris gently laid his hand over Harold's, lowering the phone. "Harold, I know this is hard to take in, but Alejandra is not real. The person in those photos, the one that you have been talking to, it was all part of the scam. Those men created her, used her to manipulate your feelings. I am so sorry." And slowly, it began to sink in. Harold's last defenses crumbled, his shoulders slumping as he buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. The bouquet of roses lay forgotten. There, on the bench beside them, sat a poignant symbol of his shattered dreams. Maurice sat with Harold, offering silent support as the elderly man grieved. Around them, the airport continued its ceaseless activity. Travelers rushed past, never noticing the heartbreak unfolding in their midst. A few curious onlookers cast sympathetic glances their way, but most married past, lost in their own journeys. When Harold's sobs had finally subsided, Maurice knew the immediate crisis was over. But the real work of healing was only just beginning. The pain of this betrayal would linger, and rebuilding trust and hope would take long and hard efforts. But as he sat there, a comforting hand on Harold's shoulder, Morris made a silent vow not to let Harold go through it alone. Somehow, he would help this kind-hearted man navigate his way through the dark into, God willing, a brighter future. The road ahead lay fraught with difficulties, but Morris was determined to be there every step of the way. He gave Harold's shoulder a gentle squeeze, drawing the older man's attention to him. "Harold," Maurice said in a soft tone, his voice filled with compassion, "I know this is overwhelming right now, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. I'm here to help you through it every step of the way." Harold looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, and lost his face etched with a pain that seemed to age him even further. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "Why would you want to help me? I'm just a foolish old man who fell for a trick. I should have known better." Maurice shook his head firmly, his eyes meeting Harold's with unwavering sincerity. "No, Harold, you're not foolish at all. You're a kind, loving person who believes in the goodness of others. That's not something to be ashamed of. If anything, the world needs more people like you, not fewer." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, pressing it gently into Harold's trembling hand. "Here's my number," Maurice explained. "I want you to call me anytime, day or night, if you need to talk or if you need help with anything related to the situation. And I mean anything, Harold. Whether it's questions about the legal process or just someone to listen when things get tough." Harold stared at the card, turning it over in his hands as if it were some kind of precious artifact. A mix of gratitude and uncertainty played across his face. "I don't know what to say, Maurice. You've already done so much. I couldn't possibly impose." Maurice cut him off gently. "You're not imposing, Harold. I want to help. And there's something else we need to talk about. What happens next?" Harold's expression turned apprehensive, but Maurice continued, his voice calm and reassuring. "We're going to need to file a report about this scam, and you might need to speak with some investigators. I know it sounds daunting, but I'll be there with you every step of the way. Well, make sure your story is heard, and do everything we can to prevent these scammers from hurting anyone else." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "And Harold, I think it might be a good idea for you to talk to someone professional about what you've been through, a counselor or therapist who specializes in helping victims of fraud. It can really help to process everything you're feeling." Harold nodded slowly, the weight of everything still evident in his posture. "I suppose that might be a good idea," he admitted softly. I feel so ashamed. How could I have been so gullible?" Maurice leaned in, his voice firm. "But kind Harold, listen to me. You have nothing to be ashamed of. These scammers are professionals. They exploit people's best qualities, their kindness, their hope, their capacity for love. You're a victim of a crime, nothing more." Harold's eyes welled up again, but this time there was a glimmer of something else beneath the tears, perhaps gratitude, or the very first little spark of resilience. Maurice felt a burst of protectiveness, recalling what Harold had confided earlier in his personal life. Maurice knew the older man had no family to turn to, and that such a kind man, facing the aftermath of this scam alone, was unbearable. "Harold, I know we have only known each other for a while, but I want you to know that I am here for you. Not just as a security officer, but as a friend. We're going to get through this together, okay?" To Maurice's amazement, Harold stretched out and pulled him into a hug. "Thank you," the older man whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for rescuing me from this, and for caring. It means more than you know." Harold looked at Morris, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You know," he said softly, his voice wavering slightly, "I had started to think the world had changed too much, that young people today didn't care about us old folks anymore." He paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But you've proved me wrong, Maurice. There's still kindness out there." Maurice felt a warmth spread through his chest at Harold's words. "There's plenty of good people in every generation, Mr. Thompson. We just have to look out for each other." Maurice stood, extending his hand to Harold. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you home. We can stop for a bite to eat on the way if you'd like, and we can talk more about the next steps, or we can just sit quietly if that's what you need." As they stepped out of the airport together, Maurice, supporting Harold's slightly unsteady steps, he knew this was only the start of the road ahead would prove difficult indeed, including legal procedures, emotional ups and downs, and the difficult step of trying to rebuild trust and hope. But Morris was resolved to being there each step of the way. When he entered this situation as a security officer doing his job, he was leaving it as a friend committed to helping Harold find his way through his many troubled times ahead of him.